Title: The One True Soulmate, rewritten. The evening air of Volnester was alive with celebration. Lanterns of glowing amber, soft blue, and drifting violet floated above the streets like captured stars. Music echoed between the buildings, blending with laughter and the scent of roasted spices, baked bread, and simmering festival dishes. The entire city felt warm and awake, as if it were breathing along with the crowd. Raimi moved through it slowly. Her long white hair flowed behind her like fresh winter snow caught in motion. Soft fox ears shifted gently at surrounding sounds, and her fluffy tail swayed with relaxed ease as she observed everything around her. She wasn't just attending the festival. She was studying it. Raimi was a professional chef, and not just any chef. She owned her own small but well-loved restaurant in Volnester. Raimi's Hearth. A place known for warm meals, creative recipes, and comforting food that made people feel at home no matter who they were. Festivals like this weren't just entertainment for her. They were inspiration. She stopped at a food stall and sampled a spiced glaze over roasted meat, thinking carefully as she jotted notes onto a small slate. Too sharp on the front of the tongue, but if softened with honeyed root vegetables. The vendor leaned in nervously. It could become something memorable, she finished, giving a small approving nod. The vendor immediately lit up with pride. After some time, Raimi drifted away from the busy center of the festival and toward a quieter edge of the square. There, the noise softened, and a single small stall sat almost unnoticed. An elderly fox woman sat on a red cushion behind a plain wooden table. She made no effort to attract attention. No shouting, no signs, just a calm, patient presence. Something about her made Raimi stop. She approached. The elder looked up and smiled gently. "Good evening, dear." Raimi offered a polite bow. "Good evening. What do you offer here?" The woman's smile deepened slightly. "Please call me Vixie." Raimi tilted her head. "Vixie. And your service?" Vixie rested her hands on the table. "I help people find their one true soulmate." Raimi blinked. "That's quite a claim." Vixie gave a soft, knowing chuckle. "Every soul has many possible matches in this universe," she said calmly. "But only one is the one meant specifically for them." She leaned forward slightly. "The one the universe created for you." Raimi crossed her arms lightly. "And you can find that?" "I do not find it," Vixie said. "I reveal it." Her gaze shifted to a small wooden block resting on the table. Carved into its center was a red handprint. "Place your right hand here," Vixie said gently. "For 30 seconds. Then speak the question aloud." Raimi hesitated. She wasn't someone who believed in fortune tricks. But the woman didn't feel like a performer. And curiosity outweighed skepticism. "All right." She placed her hand on the warm wood. Vixie spoke softly. "Say this exactly." Raimi repeated it. "What is the name of my one true soulmate, and where is he?" A few nearby festival-goers chuckled quietly, but Raimi ignored them. 30 seconds passed. Then Vixie nodded. "That is enough." Raimi lifted her hand. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the wooden block began to glow. A deep red light spread across its surface like liquid fire. Raimi stepped back slightly. "Wait, what is—" A thin shimmer rose upward. It formed into a floating red card. It hovered for a moment before settling into Vixie's hands. Vixie studied it carefully. "Interesting." Raimi took it hesitantly. Written in elegant lettering were the words, "David of Earth." Raimi blinked. "Earth?" Vixie's expression shifted, subtle surprise. "I have never seen it respond that quickly," she murmured. Raimi gave a small nervous laugh and placed a few credits on the table. "Thank you, for the experience." She turned to leave. "Wait." Vixie's voice stopped her. Raimi paused. "Yes?" Vixie raised one finger. 3 things will begin now that the connection has been recorded." Raimi slowly turned back. 3 things? Vixie's tone remained calm. "First, you will begin to dream of him. Very vividly. Second, Your thoughts will return to him without warning? Raimi frowned slightly. That sounds disruptive. And third, Vixie continued, the dreams will continue until you meet him. Raimi blinked. Meet him? Vixie nodded. The universe does not make connections without intention. Raimi looked at the card in her hand, then gave a polite shrug. Right. Of course. She tucked it carefully into her bag. Thank you, Vixie. And she walked away into the festival night. Later that evening, Raimi returned to her parents' home. It was a warm, familiar place on the quieter side of Volnester, stone walls, wooden beams, and soft, golden lantern light glowing through the windows. She lived with her parents again between restaurant work and long days managing Raimi's Hearth, her own restaurant in the city. It had grown steadily over the years, becoming known for comforting, carefully crafted meals inspired by her constant experimentation. Inside, the smell of dinner filled the house. Raimi's home. Her mother called from the kitchen. Her father looked up from the table. Festival treat you well? Raimi smiled lightly. As always. And from a nearby chair, a softer voice spoke. Come sit, dear. Her grandmother. She lived with them now, older, quiet, but always observant. There was something about her presence that made the home feel grounded. Dinner was already laid out, roasted vegetables, warm bread, and fragrant soup. They ate together slowly, talking about small things. Work. The festival. The city. You're always collecting inspiration, her mother said warmly. That's because she never stops working, her father replied. It's called passion, Raimi said calmly. Her grandmother studied her quietly over her cup of tea. Or destiny, she said at last. Raimi raised an eyebrow. That sounds dramatic. Her grandmother only smiled faintly. They finished dinner in peaceful conversation, and eventually Raimi went upstairs to her old room. She lay down still dressed in her festival clothes, staring at the ceiling as the house quieted. Eventually, sleep came. And the world changed. She was standing in a softly lit room she didn't recognize. A man was there. He looked up like he had been waiting for her. Hey, he said casually. Raimi blinked. Where am I? He shrugged. Good question. I was kind of hoping you knew. There was something easy about him. Familiar in a way she couldn't explain. They talked. About Earth. About Etheris. About oceans, glowing forests, strange worlds, and quiet lives. At one point he laughed and said, This is probably just a weird dream. Raimi studied him. Does it feel like one? He paused. No. The dream didn't give answers. It simply faded. Morning light spilled into Raimi's room. She stirred slowly. Voices drifted from downstairs. She reached for her bag, and paused. Something shifted inside. She opened it. A red card slipped out and landed on her bed. Raimi froze. That wasn't there before. Footsteps approached. Her grandmother stood in the doorway. And immediately, her expression changed. Her eyes widened slightly. Where did you get that card? Raimi blinked. From the festival last night. There was a woman, Vixie. At the name, her grandmother went still. Vixie. Raimi nodded. Yes. Her grandmother stepped forward and picked up the card carefully. So it was her. Raimi frowned. Do you know her? Her grandmother exhaled slowly. Vixie is not a fortune teller. She sat down slowly at the edge of the bed. She is a representative. Raimi tilted her head. Of what? Her grandmother looked at her seriously. Of something far older than any of us. Raimi stayed silent. When Vixie appears, her grandmother continued, it is not chance. It means the universe has taken notice of you. Raimi frowned. That sounds exaggerated. It isn't, her grandmother said firmly. She held up the red card. People who meet her are rarely ordinary. Her gaze softened slightly. And when she comes to you personally, she doesn't guess. She reveals? A pause. Then she placed the card back into Raimi's hand. Whatever she told you, believe it. Raimi looked down at the card. For the first time, it didn't feel like a curiosity. It felt like the beginning of something she didn't yet understand. The day after the festival began like any other for David. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of his apartment on Allentown-like suburbia on Earth, and yet nothing felt ordinary. He sat at the edge of his bed for a long moment, staring at the wall. The dream from the night before still clung to him with impossible clarity. The fox-haired woman. Her white hair. Her amber eyes. The way the room had felt real, more real than many places he had stood awake. David rubbed his face and exhaled. Weird dream, he muttered. But even as he said it, he knew it had not felt like a dream at all. At 32 years old, David was not someone easily rattled. He had spent years working as a welder, handling heavy machinery, sparks, molten metal, and long shifts that demanded focus. He was practical by nature. Yet all morning, his thoughts kept drifting back to her. The woman named Raimi. He shook his head and got ready for work. The workshop smelled of hot steel and oil. Bright sparks flashed in the distance where others worked, and the steady hum of machinery filled the building. David was halfway through measuring a metal support beam when someone tapped the side of his helmet. He looked up. His best friend, Mark, stood there with a concerned expression. Mark crossed his arms. You look distracted today. David removed his helmet and gave a small shrug. Do I? Yeah. Mark studied him for a moment. You feeling okay? David hesitated. He thought about saying it. About mentioning the strange dream, the woman, how real it had all been. But the words sounded ridiculous even in his own head. So he shook it off. Just weird dreams. Didn't sleep great. Mark relaxed a little. All right. But if you're getting sick, you should head home. No point passing out while holding a welding torch. David laughed softly. I'm fine. Mark gave him a suspicious look but nodded. All right. Just don't melt your boots to the floor. David smirked. No promises. But as he went back to work, he found himself staring into the bright blue arc of the welder and seeing not metal, but glowing amber eyes. He didn't tell Mark. Not yet. That night, David fell asleep quickly. And the moment sleep took him, he was somewhere else. A room he had never seen before. Soft walls of pale stone. A window glowing with moonlight. And a couch, large and covered in deep blue fabric that looked softer than anything he had ever touched. Raimi was already there. She was sitting at one end of the couch, her tail curled beside her, looking around with the same confusion he felt. When she noticed him, her ears lifted. You came back. David smiled despite himself. I was going to say the same thing. He sat at the opposite end of the couch. For a moment neither spoke. There was something strangely comfortable about the silence. Then, before either could say anything else, a soft red light appeared in the middle of the room. It spiraled slowly, like smoke made of starlight. And from it stepped Vixie. The elderly fox woman looked exactly as she had at the festival. Calm. Patient. As though appearing inside dreams was perfectly ordinary. Raimi stood up so quickly her tail fluffed out. Vixie? David nearly fell backward from the couch. Who are you? Vixie smiled gently and raised one hand. Please sit. There is much to explain. Reluctantly they sat. Vixie remained standing before them. Her expression became serious. Now that the two of you are together in the dream, I will tell him what I already told you. She looked directly at David. 3 things will begin now that the connection has been recorded. David blinked. Connection? Raimi glanced at him nervously but said nothing. Vixie raised one finger. First, you will begin to dream of each other. Very vividly. She raised a second finger. Second, your thoughts will return to one another without warning. David frowned. That already sounds inconvenient. Raimi gave him a brief look. That's exactly what I said. For the first time, both of them smiled. Vixie raised a third finger. And third, the dreams will continue until you meet. The room went quiet. David stared at her. Meat? As in, actually meat? Vixie nodded once. Yes. Either of them spoke. The weight of that settled between them. Then Vixie's expression softened. But before that day comes, there is more the universe intends for you. Raimi tilted her head. What do you mean? Vixie stepped aside and gestured toward the far wall. The room changed. The stone dissolved into light. And before them, like a window opening into another life, a scene appeared. A small child stood in a backyard. A little boy with dark hair. No older than 5. David stared. That's me. Raimi's ears twitched in surprise. The child David was laughing as he chased a red ball through the grass. Then he tripped on a stone hidden beneath the weeds. He fell hard, scraping his knee. The small boy cried out, clutching his leg. Adult David stood frozen beside Raimi, watching. The memory felt vivid. He could almost feel the sting again. Raimi looked up at him gently. You were only 5. David gave a faint smile. Still remember how much that hurt. The scene shifted. Now it was Raimi. A tiny fox girl, no more than 5 years old, standing in a warm kitchen. Her white ears were much too large for her little head, and her tail puffed out as she watched an older fox woman stir a pot. Her grandmother. The little Raimi stood on a stool, peeking into the simmering food with wide eyes. She's teaching me, Raimi whispered softly. Her voice carried wonder. The younger version of her reached for a spoon and stirred clumsily. Her grandmother laughed and guided her hand. Adult Raimi smiled without realizing it. That was the first meal I ever helped make. David looked at her. And something about seeing that memory made her feel even more real to him. The scenes continued. One after another. The two of them standing side by side, watching pieces of each other's lives. David at age 5 helping an elderly woman who had fallen outside her home on a winter sidewalk. The little boy kneeling beside her, staying with her, holding her hand while neighbors called for help. Raimi watched quietly. You stayed. David shrugged slightly, though his voice was softer. She was scared. Raimi looked at him. That says a lot about who you are. Another shift. Raimi as a child again. Her grandmother teaching her how to knead dough, her small paws pressing too hard and making the flour burst everywhere. The entire kitchen was covered in white dust. Her younger self laughed so hard she fell off the stool. David laughed out loud. Raimi covered her face with both hands. Oh no! I forgot that happened. David grinned. You were adorable. Raimi's ears turned pink. The room fell quiet again. Either of them noticed how close they were now. At some point during the memories, they had moved nearer together on the blue couch. Not touching, but close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. Vixie stood near the doorway of the dream room, watching them with calm satisfaction. At last she spoke. This is the first stage. David looked up. First stage? Vixie nodded. You will witness one another as children. As the truths of your lives unfold, so too will your bond. Raimi frowned slightly. And after that? Vixie's smile was mysterious. That is for another night. The dream began to fade. The room dimmed. The blue couch disappeared beneath them. And just before everything vanished, David looked at Raimi. For the first time, there was no uncertainty in his voice. See you tomorrow? Raimi smiled softly. Her amber eyes glowed in the fading light. Yes. And both of them woke with the memory of that single word lingering longer than anything else. David woke suddenly. For a moment he stayed perfectly still, staring at the ceiling of his apartment, trying to hold on to the fading edges of the dream. The blue couch. Vixie. The memories. Raimi standing beside him, watching his childhood as though she had always belonged there. It had all felt impossibly real. He sat up slowly and rubbed his eyes. Then something caught his attention. On the small wooden table beside his bed sat a card. A red card. It was about the size of an index card, lying flat as though someone had placed it there carefully during the night. David froze. He knew instantly it had not been there when he went to sleep. His heartbeat quickened as he reached for it. The surface felt warm. On the front, written in elegant script unlike any handwriting he had ever seen, were the words, "Rhyme of Etheris." David stared at it in silence. Then he let out a slow breath and leaned back against the bed. So, this is real. He looked toward the window where early morning sunlight filtered through the blinds. The card remained in his hand, solid and impossible. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. I need to ask if Rhyme has one too. He carefully set the card back down on the table, but this time with the strange caution one gives to something sacred. He had no idea how any of this was possible. But for the first time in his life, impossible no longer seemed impossible. Back on Etheris, Rhyme stood in the kitchen of her restaurant, Rhyme's hearth, surrounded by the familiar sounds of chopping, simmering, and the crackle of cooking fires. The warm scent of fresh bread filled the kitchen. Normally, this was where her mind felt clearest. Cooking was where she could focus, where everything else faded away. But not today. Her hands worked automatically as she seasoned a stew, but her thoughts drifted elsewhere. To a small apartment on another world. To a man with dark hair and kind eyes. To the way he had looked at her in the dream when they watched her childhood memory. You were adorable. Her ears warmed immediately at the memory. She shook her head sharply and stirred the pot harder than necessary. One of her assistants looked over. Everything all right, chef? Rhyme blinked and quickly nodded. Yes. Fine. Just distracted. The assistant smiled knowingly. You've added the salt twice. Rhyme's eyes widened. She looked down at the stew in horror. I did not. The assistant nodded carefully. Rhyme groaned softly and covered her face. That had never happened before. She took a slow breath, tasted the stew, and thankfully it was still salvageable. But the rest of the morning wasn't much better. She nearly placed sweet glaze on a savory roast. She forgot where she had set her cutting knife 3 separate times. And once, while speaking to a regular customer, she accidentally answered a question 3 seconds late because she had been wondering what David looked like when he laughed as a child. By midday, her staff had begun exchanging amused glances. Rhyme noticed. And it only made things worse. During a brief break between lunch and evening service, Rhyme stepped outside behind the restaurant. The air was cooler there, and the distant sounds of the city were softened by the stone alley walls. She sat on a wooden crate and reached into her bag. Her fingers found the red card. She pulled it out carefully. The same words stared back at her. David of Earth. She traced the lettering gently with one finger. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Whatever Vixie told you, believe it. Rhyme stared at the card for a long time. Then she smiled softly without meaning to. At first, she had thought the dreams would feel frightening. Instead, she was beginning to look forward to night. And that realization was somehow even more unsettling. She slipped the card back into her bag just as one of the kitchen workers opened the back door. Chef? Evening customers are arriving. Rhyme stood immediately and straightened her apron. Coming. But as she stepped back into the warmth of her restaurant, one thought lingered in her mind stronger than all the rest. Did David get one too? And somewhere on another world, David was wondering exactly the same thing. That night, both of them went to sleep thinking of the same thing. The red cards. David had placed his carefully back on the table beside his bed before turning out the light. He had stared at it for several minutes, wondering if touching it had somehow made the dream possible, or if it was merely proof that the dream had already become something real. Across the stars on Etheris, Rhyme had slipped her own red card back into her handbag before finally closing her restaurant for the evening. Even while brushing her hair before bed, her thoughts had kept drifting to David's face. So when sleep came, either of them was surprised to find themselves together again. This time, David opened his eyes and immediately recognized the room. It was not the blue couch chamber from before. It was a cozy living room. Warm lantern light glowed from crystal lamps set into the walls. A polished wooden table sat near a wide window, and shelves lined one wall filled with books, cooking journals, and decorative plates painted with flowers. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh bread. David looked around and smiled. "This must be your place." Raimi was already standing near the couch, her white tail flicking gently behind her. She smiled and nodded. "My living room. Or at least, a dream version of it." The couch was still there too, a wide, soft couch upholstered in deep blue fabric. As they sat down, a familiar red glow appeared in the center of the room. Vixie stepped out of it as calmly as if she had simply walked through a doorway. She smiled at them both. "Good evening, you two." Without thinking, David and Raimi answered at exactly the same time. "Good evening, Miss Vixie." The moment the words left their mouths, both of them looked at each other in surprise. Then they laughed. Vixie's smile widened slightly. "It is good to see harmony arriving so quickly." David rubbed the back of his neck, still smiling. Raimi's ears tilted slightly in embarrassment. Vixie folded her hands before her. "Let us begin tonight with David, when he was 8 years old." The room around them shimmered. The walls faded away into soft light. And the next memory formed around them. A workshop appeared. It was old but sturdy, filled with the smell of hot iron, coal smoke, and polished wood. Tools hung neatly from the walls. A forge glowed orange in one corner. In the middle of the workshop stood a young boy, David at 8 years old. His dark hair was shorter, his face rounder, but unmistakably him. Standing beside him was a taller man with strong hands and calm eyes. David's father. The older man was guiding the boy's hands carefully as they held a small metal rod over a workbench. "Steady," his father said gently. "Metal remembers the hands that shape it." Young David nodded seriously, concentrating so hard his tongue stuck out slightly. Adult David laughed softly beside Raimi. "I forgot he used to say that." Raimi watched with fascination as the boy carefully hammered the metal into shape. The scene shifted slightly. The same workshop, but now the younger David was seated at a table, working with tiny silver tools. His father placed a small piece of gold into his hands. "Precious metals require patience," he said. "They punish rushing." Young David's eyes shone with excitement as he began carefully shaping the piece into a small ring. Raimi smiled warmly. "You started learning very young." David nodded. "My dad believed if I wanted to work with my hands I should start as soon as I could safely hold a hammer." Raimi glanced at him. "That explains why you're so good at making things." David looked at her and gave a small grin. "Maybe someday I'll make something for you." The words came out before he seemed to realize what he had said. Raimi's ears turned pink. But she smiled. "I'd like that." Vixie lifted one hand, and the scene shifted again. Now they stood in a bright public square on Etheris. Colorful banners fluttered overhead, and long tables had been arranged in rows. A sign above the square read, "Young Chef's Festival Contest." David's eyes widened. "You entered a cooking contest?" Raimi folded her arms but couldn't hide her smile. "At 8. In the center of the square stood little Raimi. Her ears were too large for her small face, and her white tail puffed nervously behind her as she stood behind a table holding a pie. The smell reached them immediately. Sweet. Warm. Spiced. The crust was golden, and the filling glowed faintly orange. "What kind of pie is that?" David asked. Raimi's smile softened. "Spiced starfruit pie." Judges took small slices and tasted it. For a moment, little Raimi looked so nervous she might cry. Then all 3 judges smiled. One of them raised a small crystal trophy. "First place." Young Raimi's eyes widened in disbelief. Then she jumped up and down so excitedly that her tail nearly knocked the pie off the table. David laughed aloud. Raimi covered her face. "Oh stars, I was so proud of that pie." David smiled at her. "You should have been. It looked amazing." She lowered her hands and glanced at him. "You mean that?" "Absolutely. Her ears twitched shyly. As the memory faded and the dream room returned, David and Raimi found themselves seated on the blue couch again. For a few moments neither spoke. Then both turned toward each other at the same instant. And in perfect unison they asked, "Did you get a red card too?" They froze. Then both laughed again, louder this time. David reached into his pocket and pulled out his card. Raimi quickly opened her handbag and removed hers. The cards looked nearly identical. The same deep red. The same elegant script. Only the names differed. David held his up. "Mine says Raimi of Etheris." Raimi nodded and held hers. "Mine says David of Earth." They both stared at the cards, and then at each other. Vixie's expression remained unreadable. Finally she spoke. "Do not lose them." David looked up. "Why?" Raimi tilted her head. "What are they for?" Vixie smiled in that same mysterious way that always made it clear she knew far more than she intended to say. "For now, that is not something I will explain." David frowned. "That's not very helpful." Vixie's eyes sparkled with amusement. "It is enough for tonight." She stepped backward, red light already gathering around her. Before vanishing, she added one final sentence. "Keep them close. The day will come when they matter more than either of you realizes." Then she disappeared. The room fell silent. David looked down at his card again. Then at Raimi. She was already looking at him. And for some reason, either of them looked away. The dream began to fade. But just before everything vanished, David smiled softly. "See you tomorrow night?" Raimi's tail curled beside her as she smiled back. "I think I'm starting to look forward to that." And when they woke, both of them were smiling before they had even opened their eyes. The next morning, David woke before his alarm. For a few moments he lay in bed, staring at the red card beside him. The elegant lettering still looked just as impossible as the day before. Raimi of Etheris. He smiled faintly. What should have frightened him somehow felt like the most natural thing in the world now. He had known Raimi for only a handful of nights, and yet he already found himself thinking about her at random moments, while brushing his teeth, while making coffee, while tying his boots. Vixie had been right. His thoughts kept returning to her. And instead of resisting it, he had stopped wanting to. That afternoon, after work, David stopped by a local metal supply shop and purchased a small polished silver ingot. The shop owner raised an eyebrow. "Making jewelry now?" David gave a casual shrug. "Trying something different." He didn't explain. Because the truth sounded impossible. Back at his apartment, he laid the ingot on his workbench beside a sketchbook. He opened to a page where he had drawn a careful design. A pendant. Round. Small enough to wear around the neck. The front would have an engraved fox effigy, elegant and simple, on both sides when closed. But it would open. Inside, one side would hold a picture of him. The other side would remain empty. For now. He traced the sketch with his finger. "When we meet," he said quietly to himself, "I'll put her picture there too." He had no doubt anymore. They would meet. Somehow. And he began working. The silver glowed under the small workshop lamp as he carefully melted, shaped, and polished it late into the evening. On Etheris, Raimi's day at Raimi's hearth passed more smoothly than the last. She still thought about David far too often. But this time, instead of letting it distract her, she embraced it. During a quiet moment in the kitchen, she opened a notebook and began writing. At the top of the page. "First meal for David when we meet in person." She paused, tapping the quill against her lip. Then began listing ideas. Roasted moonroot vegetables. Honey-glazed bread. Creamed river mushrooms. Aetherian herb soup. Then she stopped. Her ears tilted. She stared at the page. "I don't even know what he likes." That thought lingered with her for the rest of the day. And by the time night came, she had decided exactly what she would ask first. That night both fell asleep with anticipation instead of uncertainty. When the dream formed, they found themselves once again in Raimi's living room. This time, Either seemed surprised to be there. David was already seated on the blue couch, turning slightly as Raimi entered from the kitchen doorway. Her ears perked the moment she saw him, and her tail gave a quick swish behind her before she seemed to realize she was doing it. David noticed, and smiled. "You look happy to see me." Raimi immediately crossed her arms. "I do not." Her tail betrayed her by swishing again. David laughed. "I'm learning that your tail disagrees with your mouth." Raimi's ears flushed faintly pink. "And I'm learning humans are far too smug." David leaned back comfortably. "You'll get used to it." She sat beside him, this time close enough that their shoulders nearly touched from the start. And neither moved away. Raimi turned toward him. "I wanted to ask you something." David nodded. "What do you like to eat?" He blinked. "That's your first question tonight?" Her ears flicked upward. "It's important." David smiled. "Well, steak, mashed potatoes, and vegetables. Pretty simple." Raimi tilted her head. "Steak?" Without a word, David reached beside the couch. A thick book appeared in his hands, as if the dream had shaped itself to his thoughts. He opened it to a picture. A full meal, seared steak, golden mashed potatoes, and green vegetables. Raimi leaned close to see. Very close. Close enough that her hair brushed his shoulder. David froze for a second but said nothing. Her amber eyes studied the page carefully. "That actually looks very good." She sat back and smiled softly. "I can make that better." David grinned. "That sounds like a challenge." Raimi's tail swayed slowly behind her. "It is." He looked at her for a moment. Then smirked. "I'm beginning to think you're competitive." Her ears lifted proudly. "I own one of the most loved restaurants in Volnester. Of course I'm competitive." David chuckled. "Good. Because I'd like to taste this famous cooking someday." Raimi looked away slightly, but her tail curled closer around her. "You will." The words came out quietly, but confidently. And both of them knew she meant it. A red shimmer appeared in the room. Vixie stepped into the dream once more. Her eyes moved between them. She smiled very faintly, noticing how close they were sitting. "It is time." Neither objected. Vixie raised one hand. The room dissolved into memory. A large public cooking hall appeared before them. This was no children's event. Rows of adults stood at polished stations, preparing elaborate dishes beneath the watchful eyes of judges. And among them stood a 10-year-old Raimi. She was barely tall enough to reach the counter. David stared. "She entered an adult competition?" Raimi folded her arms with a proud little smile. "Yes." Young Raimi moved with intense focus. She stirred a large pot filled with rich broth, herbs, vegetables, and carefully cut meat. Then she added something from a small pouch. A finely ground rare herb blend. David looked at her. "You made your own seasoning mix?" Raimi's ears lifted proudly. "At 10. The judges tasted the dish. They exchanged surprised looks. Then one of them stood and announced the winner. The youngest contestant. The hall erupted into applause. Young Raimi looked so stunned she nearly dropped her ladle. David smiled warmly. "You beat grown chefs at 10 years old." Raimi looked at him with playful pride. "Told you I was competitive." David leaned a little closer. "I'm starting to think you're dangerous." Her tail flicked against the couch. "Only if someone insults my cooking." David laughed. "Good to know." The scene shifted. A schoolyard appeared. Young David stood near a fence, carrying a bag over one shoulder. Not far away, 2 older boys were cornering a small, frail-looking girl near the playground. They were shoving her books to the ground and laughing. Raimi's ears flattened immediately. "Oh, I don't like this." Young David stopped. Watched. And then walked straight over. "What are you doing?" Raimi asked softly, though she already knew. Young David's face hardened. "That's enough," he said to the boys. The bullies laughed. One shoved him. The next few seconds happened quickly. Young David moved with startling speed. A hard shove. A punch. Then another. Both bullies were on the ground before they even understood what happened. Adult Raimi's eyes widened. At 10? David rubbed the back of his neck. I was already doing heavy work with my dad. Smithing builds strength. The younger David stood over the two boys. His voice was calm but cold. Don't even look her way again. He took a step closer. And if I find out you're still doing it when I'm not around, it'll be worse. The bullies scrambled away. The little girl stared at him, wide-eyed. Then quietly said thank you. Raimi looked at David. You really did that? David shrugged. I knew I'd regret it if I walked away. The scene changed again. David sat at home at the kitchen table while his father listened to the school's suspension notice. A week off school. His father sighed. Then looked at him. I'm a little disappointed that it came to this. Young David lowered his head. Then his father smiled faintly. But I'm still proud of you. David smiled softly at the memory. And the girl? Raimi asked. He looked at the next scene. The same girl sitting beside him at lunch a few days later, smiling shyly. We became good friends after that. Raimi's expression softened. Her tail gently brushed against his leg before she seemed to realize it. She froze. David looked down at it. Then slowly back at her. Her ears turned bright pink. That was accidental. David smiled, far too pleased. Your tale says otherwise. Raimi narrowed her eyes, trying to look stern. But the tips of her ears kept twitching nervously. David leaned a little closer, lowering his voice just enough to make her heart race. You know, if you keep doing that, I might start thinking you like me. Raimi stared at him. Then, after a brief pause, her ears lifted mischievously. She leaned just slightly toward him. And if I do? David forgot how to answer. Vixie, standing quietly nearby, smiled to herself. The dream began to fade. But this time, as the room dissolved, either of them moved apart. And when they woke, both of them could still feel exactly where they had nearly been touching. The next day felt longer than either of them wanted to admit. David spent most of his shift at the welding shop distracted in a way even Mark noticed again, though this time his friend only smirked and said, Whatever's got you smiling at random, it must be good. David only shook his head and returned to his work. But once he got home, he went immediately to his workbench. The silver pendant was beginning to take shape. The circular locket was polished smooth now, and he had started carefully engraving the front with the outline of a fox resting beneath a crescent moon. He worked slowly, making every line precise. He wanted it to be perfect. Not because he had to. Because every time he imagined giving it to Raimi in person, he felt certain that day would come. And on Etheris, Raimi found herself doing something unusual between lunch and dinner service at Raimi's hearth. She was smiling. Not because of a successful recipe. Not because of customers praising her food. But because she kept replaying David's flustered expression from the dream. And if I do? Her tail had swayed happily for nearly an hour after waking. Her kitchen staff noticed. No one said anything. But the knowing smiles were becoming difficult to ignore. That night, both went to bed almost impatiently. David opened his eyes to find himself back in Raimi's dream living room. This time, Raimi was already seated on the blue couch, but she was not pretending indifference anymore. The moment she saw him, her ears perked high and her tail gave a quick, unmistakably happy swish. David smiled immediately. Your tail greeted me before you did. Raimi narrowed her eyes, but there was no heat in it. And yet you're still here. David sat beside her, a little closer than the night before. Maybe I like the greeting. Raimi's ears flicked, but instead of looking away, she smiled. Before she could reply, the familiar red glow appeared. Vixie stepped into the room. Her expression was calm, but her eyes held a trace of warmth as she looked at how close they were now sitting. Good evening. Good evening, Miss Vixie. They answered, nearly in unison again. Vixie nodded. Tonight you will witness the years when names began to carry meaning. David frowned slightly. That sounds mysterious. Vixie gave the faintest smile. Most truths are. She lifted one hand. The dream shifted. The room dissolved into the memory of a bright autumn afternoon. A small town fair on earth. Young David, now 13, stood beside a forge display where his father was demonstrating decorative metalwork to visitors. The younger David had grown taller, stronger, his shoulders already broad from years of smithing and welding. A woman at the display smiled at him. You're very skilled for your age. What's your name, young man? The boy straightened proudly. David Redsmith, ma'am. Raimi repeated it softly beside the adult David. Redsmith. She smiled. That suits you. David looked at her. How? She tilted her head. It sounds strong. Like someone who builds things that last. David felt oddly warm hearing that. In the memory, David's father rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. His voice was proud. The Redsmith family has worked metal for generations. My father taught me, and I teach my son. Young David smiled at those words. Adult David watched quietly. I always liked hearing that. Raimi glanced at him. Your father seems like a good man. David nodded. He is. The scene faded. The next memory formed inside the warm kitchen of her parents' home on Etheris. Young Raimi stood at a counter, carefully slicing vegetables while her grandmother supervised. A customer from the restaurant was visiting, speaking with Raimi's mother. The older woman smiled at the young fox girl. She cooks better every time I visit. What is your full name, dear? Young Raimi looked up proudly. Raimi Silvertail. David blinked and smiled. Silvertail. Raimi's ears lifted slightly. It's an old family name. In the memory, her grandmother chuckled softly. The Silvertail women have always been gifted with their hands. Cooking, healing, weaving, every generation. Young Raimi puffed up proudly at that. Adult David laughed. You looked so serious. Raimi folded her arms. I was learning important things. David smirked. You were trying very hard to impress everyone. Her tail flicked behind her. Maybe. David leaned slightly closer. It worked. Her ears turned pink immediately. The dream room returned. This time, either of them moved away after the visions ended. They remained sitting close enough that their arms touched lightly against the couch. Neither mentioned it. Raimi looked at him thoughtfully. David Redsmith. He smiled. Raimi Silvertail. The way he said her full name made her ears twitch. There was something about hearing it in his voice that made her chest tighten pleasantly. David noticed. He smiled just a little. You like when I say it? Raimi looked at him, trying to maintain dignity. I did not say that. David leaned back slightly. No. Your ears did. Raimi gave him a playful glare. Then, to his surprise, she slowly moved her tail and laid the fluffy tip gently across his lap. This time very intentionally. David froze. Raimi's amber eyes glimmered with quiet amusement. You seem to be learning fox body language. David swallowed. A little. Her ears tilted mischievously. Then tell me what that means. David looked at her tail resting across him. Then at her. And smiled slowly. I think it means you're teasing me. Raimi's smile became softer. And if I am? David reached down carefully and touched the tip of her tail with the back of his fingers. It was unbelievably soft. Raimi inhaled sharply, her ears shooting straight up. Either of them moved. Vixie watched silently from the far side of the room, her knowing smile returning. The dream began fading again. But this time, just before it ended, Raimi spoke quietly. Good night, David Redsmith. David's heart skipped. He smiled back. Good night, Raimi Silvertail. And when they woke, either of them could stop smiling at the memory of hearing their names spoken by the other. That night, sleep came quickly for both of them. By now, the dreams no longer felt strange. They felt expected. Almost like meeting someone after work at a familiar place. David opened his eyes and found himself standing in a room he knew immediately. His own living room on Earth. The soft lamp near the couch was lit, the old bookshelf stood against the wall, and the small television sat in the corner exactly where it belonged. A few seconds later, he heard footsteps. Raimi stepped into the room from the kitchen doorway, looking around with wide amber eyes. Her white ears perked high as she took in the surroundings. Then she smiled. "We are at your home this time." David smiled back, already finding it strangely natural to see her there. "Yes." She turned slowly, looking at the framed pictures on the wall. The books. The couch. The blanket folded neatly over one armrest. Her tail swayed behind her as she walked deeper into the room. "It feels comfortable." David's smile softened. "I'm glad." Then he tilted his head slightly. "Want to see the rest of the house?" Raimi looked back at him immediately, her ears lifting. "Yes." David led her through the dream version of his home. The kitchen first. Simple and clean. Raimi immediately inspected the stove. "You actually cook?" David laughed. "A little." She opened a cabinet. "Mostly canned soup." David rubbed the back of his neck. "Okay, maybe not much." Her tail swished with amusement. Then he showed her the small guest room. His bedroom. The study where he kept books and sketches of metalwork designs. Raimi looked at everything with open curiosity, as if each little detail helped her understand him better. And the whole time, David found himself oddly nervous. Because there was one room he hoped she would ignore. The garage workshop. As they reached the hallway near the back door, David tried to steer her away. "And that's just storage." Raimi paused. Her ears angled suspiciously. "Storage?" David nodded too quickly. "Yes. Boring storage." Raimi gave him a look. The exact kind of look that said she knew he was hiding something. Then, without a word, she walked to the door and opened it. David sighed. "Of course." The garage was lit by hanging lamps. A workbench stood against one wall, covered in tools, metal pieces, and carefully organized supplies. Raimi's eyes widened. Her tail swayed faster. "This is where you make things." David smiled despite himself. "Yeah." She stepped farther in, admiring the tools. Then her eyes landed on the small cloth-covered object resting on the workbench. She looked back at him. David knew exactly what she was going to do. She lifted the cloth. Underneath sat the unfinished silver pendant. The round locket was almost complete. The engraved fox on the front gleamed softly under the light. Raimi picked it up carefully. Her ears slowly lifted higher and higher. David's face warmed immediately. He sighed. "Ah well. It's not finished yet." He stepped beside her and smiled a little awkwardly. "It's something I'm making for you, for when we meet in person." The moment the words left his mouth, he felt his face grow even warmer. Raimi turned to him slowly. The pendant still in her hands. Her amber eyes were bright with amusement. And affection. Her tail curled behind her. "Oh?" David cleared his throat. "It opens. I was going to put my picture on one side." Raimi looked at him with a teasing expression. "And the other side?" David smiled, a little shyly. "When we meet, I was going to ask for a picture of you." Raimi's ears turned slightly pink. But her smile became softer. "That's unexpectedly sweet." David shrugged. "Well, I like planning ahead." Raimi stepped a little closer, still holding the pendant. Her tail brushed lightly against his leg. "And here I thought you were just a grumpy welder." David laughed. "Grumpy?" She tilted her head innocently. "A little." Then she smiled mischievously. "I think it's adorable that you're already making me gifts." David looked at her. Then smiled slowly. "I think it's adorable that you snoop through my house." Raimi's ears flicked. She laughed softly. Before either of them could say more, the familiar red glow appeared. Vixie had arrived. Vixie stood quietly in the workshop. Her expression was more solemn than usual. The warmth in the room dimmed slightly. She looked at them both. "Tonight will be a little sad." The teasing between David and Raimi faded immediately. Both turned toward her. Vixie folded her hands. You will witness the sorrows that shaped you when you were 15. Mather spoke. Vixie raised one hand. And the dream shifted. Rain. A gray sky. The scene formed outside a modest home on Earth. A younger David stood on a porch, his face pale, staring at two police officers speaking quietly to his grandparents. Raimi's ears lowered immediately. She glanced at David, but he was already watching the memory. Silent. The younger David's hands trembled. The officers removed their hats. And even without hearing every word, the meaning was clear. Car accident. His parents. Gone. Raimi instinctively reached for David's hand beside her. He looked down in surprise. But he didn't let go. The scene shifted. Young David sat alone in his room later that night, staring at the wall. A photograph of his parents lay in his lap. He looked lost. Then another memory. A few days later. His father's voice echoed from an older memory in his mind. The two of them had been working in the forge together. His father had said, "When a family member dies, grieve today, but don't forget about tomorrow." Young David closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and stood. The scene moved forward through the years. He lived with his grandparents. Worked hard. Learned faster. At 18, he got a welding job. Saved for an apartment. Bought groceries for his grandparents. Fixed things around their home. Laughed again. Slowly. Painfully. But truly. Adult David watched all of it quietly. Then said softly, "Keeping busy helped." Raimi's tail wrapped gently around his wrist. A silent comfort. She looked at him. "You were very strong." David shook his head slightly. "I just didn't want to lose tomorrow, too." Her eyes softened. The dream shifted again. A warm home kitchen on Etheris. Young Raimi stood by a window, tears on her cheeks. Her grandfather's walking chair sat empty. The silence in the house felt heavy. David looked at her. Raimi's ears had lowered. Her tail lay still. The younger Raimi wiped her eyes. Then walked slowly to the kitchen counter. Her grandmother entered. Said nothing. Only stood nearby. Young Raimi opened a cookbook. Then another. Then began chopping vegetables. The knife shook at first. But she kept going. Hours passed. The kitchen slowly filled with the scent of herbs, broth, and baking bread. Her tears did not stop immediately. But her breathing steadied. Her hands became certain again. Her grandmother tasted the soup. Then hugged her tightly. The old fox woman whispered, "You cook when your heart hurts because your love stays in the food." Adult Raimi looked down. Her voice was very quiet. She was right. David squeezed her hand. And this time she leaned closer to him without hesitation. The dream returned to David's living room. But neither moved away from each other. They sat on the couch in silence. Their hands still together. After a while, Raimi spoke softly. "I think your father was wise." David nodded. "He was." She looked at him. "And I think he'd be proud of who you became." David turned toward her. There was something in her eyes now that had changed. Something deeper than curiosity. Something gentle. Her ears remained lowered, but not from sadness anymore. They were relaxed. Trusting. David smiled faintly. "And your grandfather would be proud of you too." Raimi's tail slowly curled around his arm again. This time she didn't move it away. Instead, she rested her head lightly against his shoulder. David froze for a brief moment. Then relaxed. And smiled. Vixie watched them quietly. Her expression warm. The red cards in both of their pockets gave the faintest pulse of light. But neither noticed. Because for the first time, the silence between them felt more intimate than words. And when the dream faded that night, both of them woke with the lingering memory of not feeling alone in their grief anymore. Morning came with an unusual kind of excitement for both of them. The dreams had become more than dreams now. They were learning each other, little by little, in ways no ordinary conversation ever could. And both had begun preparing for a meeting that neither doubted would someday happen. On Earth, David woke early, made himself breakfast, and after eating went straight into the garage workshop. Sunlight streamed through the small window above the bench, falling across the nearly finished silver pendant. He picked it up carefully. The locket was almost complete now. The fox effigy engraved on the front had turned out better than he expected, sleek, elegant, and unmistakably inspired by Raimi's ears and tail. He opened it. Inside, one side already held a small printed photo of himself. The other side remained empty. Waiting. David smiled as he polished the inside edge. Just a little longer. He could already picture handing it to her. Seeing her hold something he had made with his own hands. The thought made him work even more carefully. On Etheris, Raimi closed her restaurant for the day and did something her staff had never seen. She took an entire day off without a special occasion. That alone caused several whispered conversations. But Raimi didn't care. She had something important to do. At the market, she visited the butcher stalls and purchased several cuts of meat from different animals, trying to find the closest equivalent to what David had shown her in the picture book from their dream. The vendors were curious. Raimi was usually very specific. Today, she looked like she was conducting an experiment. By midday, carrying several packages and herbs, she arrived at her parents' home. Her mother opened the door and smiled. "Raimi! I wasn't expecting you." Raimi lifted the baskets. "I need to use your stove." Her mother laughed warmly. "Of course." Inside, her father was reading near the window, and her grandmother sat comfortably near the kitchen table sorting herbs. The older fox woman looked up immediately. Her eyes narrowed knowingly. "What are you cooking?" Raimi paused. Then set everything down. She decided there was no point hiding it. As she prepared ingredients, she began telling them everything. About David. About the nightly dreams. About the shared memories. About the red cards. And about the meals they had talked about. Her parents listened in stunned silence. Her grandmother simply nodded from time to time, as though much of it confirmed what she already believed. Finally, her mother blinked. "You dream of him every night?" Raimi nodded while slicing vegetables. "Yes." Her father leaned back. "And he's really on another world? Earth?" "Yes." Her mother exchanged a look with her husband. Then smiled softly. "We would really like him, I think." Raimi's ears lifted slightly. "You think so?" Her mother laughed. "If he listens to you talk about food and still looks at you the way you described, then yes." Raimi's ears turned pink. Her father folded his arms. "But how will he get here? Earth can't travel that far in space yet." Raimi's hands slowed for a moment. "I know." Then she smiled faintly. "But Vixie said there is a way." Her grandmother set down the herbs and spoke immediately. "If Vixie says so, I believe her." The room went quiet. No one argued. Because in that house, when Vixie's name came up, doubt seemed almost disrespectful. Raimi returned to cooking, but her tail swayed a little more happily after that. That night, when sleep took them, Raimi opened her eyes and found herself once again in David's home. But something was different. The air was rich with a mouth-watering aroma. She stepped into the living room and immediately paused. Her ears perked high. Her nose twitched. From the kitchen came the unmistakable scent of roasted meat, butter, and herbs. Raimi followed it instantly. David stood at the stove, placing food onto 2 plates. He turned and smiled when he saw her. "What smells good?" she asked, unable to hide her curiosity. David grinned. "I've been thinking." Raimi stepped closer, watching him. "If we can touch things in our shared dream, and smell them." He placed the plates on the table and looked at her. "Maybe we can taste too." Raimi's eyes widened. David pulled out a chair for her. "You were wondering about making me a steak dinner, right?" He gestured toward the plate. A perfectly cooked steak. Mashed potatoes. Vegetables. Exactly like the picture he had shown her. "Let's see if you can taste it here." Raimi sat slowly, almost reverently. David sat across from her. For a moment neither spoke. Then Raimi picked up a fork and cut a small piece of the steak. She brought it to her mouth. Chewed. Then froze. Her amber eyes widened. David leaned forward. Well? She swallowed slowly. Then stared at him. You cook this? David smiled. Yes. Raimi took another bite. Then another. Her ears stood straight up. Her tail swished rapidly behind her. It's delicious. David laughed. I'll take that as a good sign. Raimi looked at the steak thoughtfully. I know a kind of meat at home that tastes like this. David smiled. That's good. She looked at him. And her expression became softer. Because if I had to choose to move where you are. Her ears lowered shyly. I know I would say yes to that. David nearly forgot to breathe. His face warmed. He smiled slowly. That's a pretty strong review for my cooking. Raimi laughed softly. And your cooking isn't the only reason. Her tail reached under the table and gently brushed against his leg. Deliberately. David looked at her. And just as he opened his mouth to answer, a red glow appeared. Vixie had arrived. Vixie stood beside the kitchen doorway, smiling faintly at the half-finished dinner. I see the bond grows stronger. David leaned back, trying not to look too obviously disappointed at the interruption. Raimi hid a smile. Vixie raised one hand. Tonight you will see how each of you built the life you now live. The kitchen faded. The memory began. The first vision formed in the center of Volnester. A younger adult Raimi stood before a small building with a newly painted sign above the door. Raimi's hearth. Her ears were trembling with excitement. Her parents stood nearby, smiling proudly. Her grandmother placed a small charm above the doorway for luck. Young Raimi unlocked the front door for the first time. David watched quietly. She really built all of it herself. Inside, the restaurant was much smaller than now. Only a few tables. A tiny kitchen. But the moment the first meal was served, the customers' faces lit up. Word spread quickly. Days became weeks. The small restaurant became popular. Then beloved. Then famous. Raimi watched her younger self wipe tears of joy from her face after the first month of success. David smiled. You earned every bit of it. Raimi looked down shyly. Her tail brushed his arm. Thank you? The scene shifted. Back on Earth. David, now in his 20s, stood in a larger workshop. Not the small garage at home. A professional smithing and fabrication shop. Clients spoke to his supervisor. Again and again, they asked for one name. David Red Smith. Raimi smiled proudly as she watched him create intricate railings, custom metal art, welded machinery repairs, and even delicate jewelry. One customer held up a custom iron gate and said, Only David does work this clean. Another nodded. Best blacksmith and welder in the county. Raimi looked at him with open admiration. You became famous too. David shrugged, embarrassed. Locally. She smiled. Still watching the memory. I'm proud of you. The words were simple. But they made his heart pound harder than expected. When the memory faded, the dream kitchen returned. Their dinner still sat warm on the table. Vixie stood quietly for a moment. Then disappeared without another word. Neither noticed. Because Raimi had moved her chair closer while watching the memories. And now they sat side by side, sharing the same plate of mashed potatoes. David looked at her. She looked back. Her ears tilted softly. And for the first time, the silence between them wasn't just comfortable. It felt like the beginning of something that neither of them wanted to rush. But neither wanted to stop either. The next morning, David woke with the kind of calm certainty that had become familiar over the past months. He made breakfast, ate quickly, and went straight into the garage workshop before even turning on the radio. The silver pendant waited on the workbench. Nearly finished. He sat down, took a careful breath, and began the last of the detailed work. For hours, David polished the outer fox engraving until the silver gleamed perfectly. He adjusted the tiny hinge one final time, tested the clasp, and then opened it. Inside, His photographs sat neatly in place. The empty side waited for only one thing. Rimey. David smiled to himself. At last, he closed the pendant and held it up under the light. Perfect. He turned it over in his hand, the fox effigy catching the sunlight. This is for you, he said quietly, as though she could somehow hear him. Later that morning, before work, he stopped at a small shop and bought a dark blue velvet box to place the pendant inside. He tucked it safely into a drawer beside his bed. For the day they would meet. Not if. When. At work, David was nearly impossible to miss. Everything he did, welding beams, repairing a broken farm gate, shaping custom brackets, he did with an unmistakably goofy, happy smile. His best friend Mark noticed almost immediately. Mark stared for a moment, while David absent-mindedly smiled at a welding torch. Then he laughed. Okay, that's it. David looked up. What? Mark folded his arms. You've either secretly won the lottery, or you're in love. David nearly dropped the tool in his hand. Mark grinned wider. That bad, huh? David shook his head, trying not to laugh. Just had a good week. Mark snorted. Sure. Good week. David said nothing else. But his smile never really faded. Because every spare thought drifted back to white hair, amber eyes, fox ears, and a tail that had become increasingly expressive. On Etheris, Rimey spent the day in the kitchen of Rimey's hearth with a focus so intense her staff dared not interrupt her. The dish in front of her looked familiar. A thick cut of meat. Mashed root vegetables. A plate arranged almost exactly like the one David had cooked in the dream. She had spent several days perfecting it. And today, she was determined to make it even better. Not for the restaurant. Not for any customer. For David. She seasoned the meat carefully, cooked it, tasted it, frowned, adjusted the herbs, and tried again. By the fourth attempt, she paused. Took a bite. Her ears slowly rose. Her tail gave a delighted swish. Then a second. Then a third. A goofy, delighted smile spread across her face. One of her kitchen assistants glanced over and whispered to another. Chef is smiling at the steak again. Rimey heard it. Her ears turned pink. But she didn't stop smiling. Because all she could think was, I hope he likes this when he comes here. And the thought made her look every bit as happy and distracted as David on another world. That night came slowly. Painfully slowly. But eventually both lay down to sleep, each with the same quiet anticipation. And when the dream formed, they found themselves inside Rimey's home. This time, not the living room. Her actual house. The cozy private home attached above her restaurant. The fireplace glowed softly, and the scent of herbs lingered in the kitchen. David stood near the window, taking it in. A moment later, Rimey walked in from the hall. Her ears lifted instantly when she saw him. Her tail swayed with no attempt to hide it. David smiled. I think I'm getting spoiled seeing your tail do that. Rimey smirked and sat beside him on the couch. Then don't get used to it. Her tail immediately curled against his side. David laughed. Your tail disagrees again. She rolled her eyes, but leaned against him anyway. Before either could say more, the familiar red light appeared. Vixie stepped into the room. But tonight she did not raise her hand to show memories. Instead, she simply sat in the chair across from them. David and Rimey exchanged a glance. Vixie smiled gently. You know, it has been 6 months since you first met me, Rimey. Rimey blinked. Has it really? Vixie nodded. And 6 months since your dreams were joined. David looked thoughtful. That feels both very short and very long. Vixie folded her hands. Tonight, I will show no memories. Her eyes moved between them. Instead, I ask you both something. They waited. Vixie's smile deepened. What do you two want to do now? Silence settled over the room. David and Rimey looked at one another. Their eyes met. Neither looked away. And then David spoke first. His voice was calm. Certain. I would like to move to Etheris. Rimey's ears shot upright. David turned fully toward her. If Raimi would want me to come there. The room went quiet. Raimi stared at him. Her tail froze in place for a moment, then slowly began swaying again. She looked genuinely surprised, though not because she disliked the idea. Only because hearing him say it out loud made it suddenly real. David's expression softened. I've thought about it a lot. He looked down at his hands for a moment. Earth is my home. But… Then he looked back into her amber eyes. You're becoming someone I can't imagine not being with. Raimi's ears slowly lowered, not from sadness, but from being overwhelmed. Her tail curled around his arm. She spoke quietly. You would leave your world, for me? David smiled. I think I would travel a lot farther than that. The words struck her harder than he realized. Her eyes shimmered slightly. And before she could stop herself, she leaned in and hugged him tightly. Her tail wrapped around his waist. David blinked in surprise, then smiled and held her just as tightly. Vixie watched them silently, her expression calm, knowing. And after a few moments, Raimi pulled back just enough to look at him. Her ears twitched shyly. Her voice was almost a whisper. If you came to Etheris, she smiled softly, I would want you to stay. David's heart pounded. He looked at her for several seconds, then smiled in the way he only ever did for her. Well, he gently touched the red card in his pocket. Then I think we should start figuring out how. Across from them, Vixie smiled. And for the first time, the red cards in both their pockets glowed bright enough for all three to see. The red cards in their pockets glowed brighter and brighter, casting a warm crimson light across Raimi's living room. David and Raimi both stared in stunned silence. The glow pulsed like a heartbeat. Steady. Alive. Across from them, Vixie's calm expression slowly changed. And for the first time since either of them had met her, the elderly fox woman broke into a wide, delighted smile. She looked at both of them and clasped her hands together. Before we go any further, be truthful in your answer. Her eyes sparkled knowingly. Do you two love each other? David and Raimi looked at one another. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. And as if their hearts had already learned to move together, they answered at exactly the same time. Yes, with all my heart. The words overlapped perfectly. The moment they said it, both of them froze in surprise. Then looked at each other again, their faces slowly warming. Vixie giggled softly. I knew you did. She smiled wider. I simply had to ask. Raimi's ears were standing so high they almost trembled. Her tail curled tightly around David's arm. She looked down at the glowing red cards still in her hand. Then back at Vixie. What does it mean? Vixie tilted her head. When one of my red cards glows like this. She paused just long enough for both of their hearts to race. It means it is time for the two soulmates to meet in person. Silence. David blinked. Raimi's breath caught. Neither spoke. Then Raimi whispered. Really? Vixie nodded. Yes. David looked down at the card in his hand. The red light reflected across his face. Then Vixie turned toward him. David. Her voice was gentle but direct. Are you absolutely sure you wish to move to Etheris? David did not even pause. Yes, Vixie. He turned to Raimi. His expression softened in a way that made her heart ache. As long as Raimi is there. I want to be there. Raimi's eyes filled with tears instantly. Her ears lowered with emotion. Her tail wrapped tighter around him. Vixie smiled. Then it is settled. David stared. Settled? Vixie nodded as though discussing the weather. When you wake, David, you will be on Etheris. For a moment, David simply stared at her. She continued. You and the gift you made for Raimi will awaken on her couch. David's jaw slowly dropped. Vixie went on. Your clothing, tools, and personal belongings needed for a new life will be placed in Raimi's shed in her backyard. David blinked several times, then pointed at himself. You mean, tomorrow? Vixie smiled. When you wake. David stared for another second. then laughed in pure disbelief. A nervous, excited laugh. I really hope I'm not having a dream within a dream. That made Raimi laugh through her tears. And before either of them could think, she threw herself into his arms and hugged him so tightly he nearly fell backward onto the couch. Her tears soaked into his shirt as she buried her face against him. You're coming here. Her voice trembled with joy. You're really coming here. David wrapped both arms around her and held her close. He was laughing too, but his own eyes had become suspiciously bright. Yes. He buried his face in her hair. I'm coming. For several long moments, they simply held each other, neither wanting to let go. Then, almost at the exact same time, they both pulled back, looked at Vixie, and then, without saying a word, both jumped up and rushed toward her. Vixie barely had time to react before they hugged her from both sides. The old fox woman laughed in surprise. Ah! She smiled brightly and patted both of them. You two are so cute. David laughed. Raimi wiped at her tears and smiled. Thank you, Vixie. David nodded. Really, thank you? Vixie's eyes softened. She gently stepped back once they released her. I am very happy to see you two together. Then her expression became a little wistful. I may never see you again. Raimi's ears lowered slightly. What? Vixie smiled. I am always very busy. She lifted one paw gently. But now and then, I will look in on you too. Her eyes sparkled. To see how things are going. David smiled warmly. I'd like that. Raimi nodded. So would I. Vixie's form began to glow red again. The light surrounded her like drifting embers. Her smile became the kind one gives when seeing a story end exactly as it should. Then sleep peacefully, you two. Her voice became softer as the light brightened. Tomorrow, your real life begins. And with that, she vanished. The room fell silent. David and Raimi stood there for only a second, then turned toward each other. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. Raimi reached for him first. David met her halfway, and they held each other until the dreams slowly faded away. Both smiling, both trembling, and both knowing that when they opened their eyes next, they would no longer be worlds apart. Morning came far too fast. At least, that was how it felt to Raimi. The moment her eyes opened, she sat straight up in bed. For one heartbeat she simply stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Then the memories of the night before came flooding back. Her ears shot upright. The red card. Vixie. David. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it. Without even stopping to fix her hair, Raimi threw off the blankets and ran out of her bedroom so fast her bare feet barely touched the floor. She reached the living room. And there, exactly where Vixie had said, David was asleep on her couch. Real. Not glowing dreamlight. Not fading mist. Actually there. He was lying on his back, one arm hanging off the side of the couch, still sleeping peacefully as morning sunlight streamed through the windows. Raimi stared for less than half a second. Then she let out a squeak of joy, ran forward, and launched herself over the back of the couch. She landed directly on top of him. David woke with a startled sound. What? Before he could even sit up, Raimi wrapped both arms around him tightly and kissed him. Hard. Warm. Real. Tears of happiness were already running down her cheeks. David's eyes widened in surprise for only an instant. Then he laughed softly against her lips and kissed her back, wrapping his arms around her as the reality of it finally sank in. She was warm. Her hair smelled faintly of lavender and spices. Her fox ears twitched against his forehead, and her tail was pressed against his leg. David closed his eyes and held her as though afraid the moment might disappear if he let go. But it didn't. Because this was not a dream. After a long while, the two finally calmed enough to simply sit together. They moved to the center of the couch, sitting shoulder to shoulder. Raimi leaned close, resting her head against David's shoulder. Her fluffy tail wrapped around his waist possessively, as though silently claiming him. David smiled at the feeling. Neither spoke for a few quiet minutes. They simply sat there, listening to each other breathe. Finally, David broke the silence. He turned his head slightly toward her. Do you remember I told you I made something for you? Raimi lifted her head, her amber eyes bright. The gift? David nodded, smiling. I worked very hard on it. He reached into the pocket of the jacket Vixie had brought with him and carefully pulled out the small dark blue velvet box. Raimi's breath caught instantly. She sat up straighter. Her ears lifted high. David placed the box gently in her hands. For a moment, Raimi just stared at it. Then she opened it. The silver pendant caught the morning light and gleamed brilliantly. The fox effigy on the front was beautifully crafted, delicate yet strong. Raimi's eyes widened. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it from the box. It's beautiful. David smiled softly, watching her reaction. She looked at him, overwhelmed. I love it. The words came out almost as a whisper. David leaned closer. Open it. Raimi carefully did. The pendant opened with a soft click. Inside, on one side, was the tiny photograph of David. Raimi blinked in surprise and smiled. Then David gently pointed to the empty side. When we took pictures in the dreams, they never stayed when I woke up. He smiled sheepishly. So I left that side empty. He looked into her eyes. For when we take a real picture together. Raimi stared at him. For several seconds she said nothing. Then her lower lip trembled slightly. Her tail tightened around him. And before David could say anything else, Raimi threw her arms around his neck again and hugged him tightly. You made this for me. David laughed softly and held her. Of course. Raimi pulled back just enough to look at him. Tears shimmered again, but this time her smile was so bright it almost made David forget to breathe. She gently touched the photo inside the pendant. Then looked back at him. You know. Her ears tilted playfully. You're much more handsome in person. David laughed. Oh? Is that so? Raimi nodded and leaned closer, her nose almost touching his. Yes. Her tail swished once behind her. And now I can kiss you whenever I want. David smiled slowly. I was hoping you'd say that. Raimi grinned. Then kissed him again. This time slower. Softer. And far less rushed. Outside, the morning sun rose over Volnester. Inside the small home above Raimi's hearth, two soulmates sat together for the first real morning of their lives. And for both of them, the universe had never felt so perfectly kind. Raimi stayed close to David for a long moment after their kiss, as if still making sure he was really there. Then she suddenly stood up, ears perked with excitement. Come on! David blinked. Where are we going? Raimi grabbed his hand. To meet my parents. David froze mid-step. Your parents? Raimi nodded cheerfully. And my grandmother. That made him pause even longer. He pointed at himself slightly. Right now? Raimi smiled like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Right now? David exhaled slowly, then gave a small nervous laugh. I'm looking forward to it, but I'm also nervous. Raimi squeezed his hand gently. They will love you. Then she tilted her head playfully. Almost as much as I do. David coughed slightly at that and tried not to trip over absolutely nothing. Okay. That's a high bar. Raimi giggled and pulled him forward. The streets of Volnester were already alive with morning activity. As they walked, Raimi naturally slipped into tour guide mode, pointing things out as they went. That's the Crystal Bakery, she said. They use light-grown grains. That's the transport line hub. And over there is, well... She slowed slightly and gestured ahead. Her restaurant. Raimi's hearth stood warm and welcoming even in the early light, its wooden sign gently glowing. David stopped. So that's yours. Raimi nodded proudly. It is. David studied it for a moment, clearly impressed. It looks like it's been here forever. Raimi smiled softly. That's what I wanted. Then she gently tugged his hand again. But I want you to meet my parents first. David nodded quickly. Right. Parents first. Focus. Raimi laughed and continued walking with him. As they moved deeper into the city, David began to notice something. People were watching them. Not in a hostile way. Not even judgmental. Just curious. Whispers followed them lightly through the streets. A human walking among them was rare enough to draw attention. Vulpine folk with fox-like ears and tails, lupin citizens with wolfish features, and feline travelers with sharp eyes all turned their heads as he passed. David leaned slightly toward Raimi. Is this normal? Raimi nodded casually. For you? Yes. She smiled faintly. There aren't many humans here. David raised an eyebrow. How many? Raimi thought for a moment. Very few. My grandmother says she hasn't seen one since she was a child. David let out a low whistle. Wow. Raimi squeezed his hand again. Don't worry. They're just curious because you're with me. David glanced at her. That makes it sound like I'm a rare exotic animal. Raimi smirked. You kind of are. David sighed dramatically. Great. I've been upgraded to rare exhibit. Raimi laughed, tail flicking happily behind her. Eventually, they arrived at a comfortable, well-kept home near the quieter edge of the city. It was warm, lived in, and filled with the faint smell of herbs and cooked meals. Raimi didn't hesitate. She opened the door. Good morning, she called inside. Then, louder. I have a huge surprise to tell everyone. David stood just behind her, suddenly very aware of his heartbeat. He straightened his posture, whispered to himself, Okay, here we go, and followed her inside. Raimi stepped further into the house, still holding David's hand tightly as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. She called out brightly, Mom! Dad! Grandma! I'm here, and I have a surprise! A voice immediately answered from deeper inside. We're in the kitchen! Raimi turned to David with a grin. This way. David followed her down a short hallway, each step making his nerves spike a little higher. Not because he doubted her, but because he cared. When they entered the kitchen, the warmth of the room hit immediately, fresh food, morning light, and the quiet hum of family life already in motion. Raimi's father looked up from the table first. He paused. What did you say when you came in? Raimi blinked. Then immediately brightened again. Oh, right. I have a surprise. She stepped aside with dramatic flair, as if presenting something far more important than breakfast. This is David Redsmith. Her tail flicked proudly behind her. My one true soulmate that Vixie found for me. The room went still for a moment. Raimi's mother slowly set down what she was holding. Her grandmother, seated calmly at the table, studied David with sharp, knowing eyes. Then she spoke first. So you are David from Earth? David straightened slightly. Yes, ma'am. Her gaze softened just a little. Then she held out a paw. May I see both of your red cards from Vixie? Without hesitation, David pulled his from his pocket. Raimi did the same. Both cards shimmered faintly as they were placed on the table. The grandmother leaned forward, studying them carefully. A long silence followed. Then she nodded once. You two have our blessing for the bonding ceremony. David blinked. Bonding ceremony? Raimi glanced at him, then smiled softly. It's like getting married. David processed that for half a second. Then nodded. Okay. Then I think I need to get some rings. Before Raimi could respond, her grandmother shook her head gently. There is no need. She reached into a small box she had brought out from another room. It would be my honor if you take mine, and your grandfather's rings. She placed them carefully on the table. Simple. Worn. Meaningful. Raimi froze. Then her eyes filled instantly. Grandma! Her voice broke as she reached for them. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she held the rings in her hands. David watched quietly, suddenly realizing just how serious this moment truly was. Raimi's father leaned back in his chair, then laughed softly to himself. Now that I think about it, Everyone looked at him. He grinned. If you can prove the union was blessed by Vixie herself, with the 2 red cards, then you get a house and land in Volnester. David blinked. Raimi looked up sharply. Her father continued, more amused now. And you will never pay taxes. David slowly pointed at himself. That's a thing? Her father nodded. Oh yes. Then he laughed again, clearly enjoying the surprise on David's face. We'll go to the mayor of Volnester. I think he'll bond you 2 on the spot. Raimi's mother finally spoke gently, smiling at them both. But first, she gestured toward the table. Let's eat breakfast together. Raimi wiped her tears quickly, still smiling through them. David looked at her family, then at her. And slowly, his nervous expression softened into something warmer. Yeah, he said quietly. I'd like that. And for the first time since arriving on Etheris, David wasn't just meeting Raimi's world. He was being welcomed into it. After breakfast, the excitement in the house was impossible to contain. Raimi could barely sit still. Her tail swayed constantly, and every few moments she would glance at David just to make sure he was still really beside her. David, for his part, was trying to stay calm. But the truth was written all over his face. He looked just as excited as she was. With Raimi's parents and grandmother wishing them luck, the 2 of them left together and made their way into the heart of Volnester. The mayor's office stood in a broad stone building decorated with crystal lanterns and carved wooden arches. As they entered, several clerks looked up curiously. One of them noticed David immediately. A human standing beside Raimi was unusual enough. The 2 red cards in their hands made it extraordinary. They were directed to a polished wooden desk where an assistant helped them begin filling out the official paperwork for the bonding ceremony. David looked over the forms. Most were simple enough. Names, birthplaces, residence declarations. Raimi's hand trembled slightly while writing. David noticed and gently placed his hand over hers. She smiled and relaxed immediately. Once the papers were complete, the assistant stood quickly and disappeared through a side door carrying both red cards. Only a moment later, a voice from inside the office rang out loud enough to hear through the hallway. Get me Raimi and David immediately! There was a brief pause. Then the same voice again, now clearly excited. Their union has been blessed by Vixie. The assistant returned almost instantly. Her expression had changed from polite professionalism to wide-eyed amazement. This way, please. The mayor's office was larger than David expected. Bookshelves lined the walls, and tall windows overlooked the city square. Behind a carved desk stood the mayor himself, smiling warmly. He stepped forward immediately. My apologies for the wait. David shook his head politely. No need to apologize. The mayor smiled and gave a small nod. Well spoken. He gestured for them to sit. Then he looked carefully at David. His expression became thoughtful. Do you know how long it has been since Vixie brought a human here? David blinked. No, sir. The mayor leaned back in his chair. It has been 500 years. David stared. The mayor smiled at his reaction. So yes, quite some time. He folded his hands together. And that was before Earth began receiving regular visitors from space. David glanced at Raimi. She looked just as surprised as he was. The mayor gave them both a warm smile. So, shall we begin? Then, as he reached for the paperwork, his eyes caught something around Raimi's neck. He paused. That is a beautiful pendant. Raimi's ears perked proudly. She touched it gently. David made it for me. The mayor raised his eyebrows. Did he? Raimi nodded and opened the pendant. Inside were now 2 tiny pictures, David's on one side, and a new one of Raimi that she had quickly added that morning. The mayor smiled genuinely. That's beautiful. He looked at David. My boy, I think you are very talented. David smiled modestly. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The mayor leaned forward slightly. If I get you the materials, could you make one for my daughter? David blinked. She is 10 years old. The mayor explained. She'll be 11 in 6 months. It would make a perfect gift. David smiled warmly. I would be honored. The mayor laughed softly. I suspected you would say that. Then he straightened and placed the paperwork neatly on the desk. Well then. He looked at them both with a formal but kind expression. Let us begin the bonding, shall we? He folded his hands. Do you two have the bonding rings? David reached into his pocket and carefully pulled out the small cloth pouch Raimi's grandmother had given them. He opened it and showed the 2 rings. Yes. The mayor's smile softened when he saw them. He recognized immediately that they were old family rings. Meaningful ones. He nodded respectfully. Then today will be a very special day. Raimi reached for David's hand. He held it tightly. And together, standing side by side in the mayor's office, with the red cards resting on the desk between them, they prepared to bind their lives together at last. The mayor rose from behind his desk and led them into a smaller ceremonial chamber connected to his office. It was simple, but beautiful. Soft blue crystal lanterns glowed along the walls, and tall windows let sunlight pour into the room. In the center stood a carved wooden platform where countless couples had been bonded over the centuries. David and Raimi stepped onto the platform together. For the first time that morning, both looked visibly nervous. Raimi's ears twitched constantly, and her tail wrapped around David's arm like it was holding on for dear life. David tried to stand calmly, but his heartbeat was so loud he was sure everyone could hear it. A few moments later, the witnesses entered. There were only 4. The mayor's assistant, Raimi's mother, Raimi's father, and her grandmother. The small group gathered quietly near the front. Raimi's grandmother held her paws clasped tightly together, smiling with unmistakable pride. The mayor stepped in front of David and Raimi and opened a ceremonial book. His voice became formal yet warm. Today, under the laws of Volnester and under the blessing of Vixie, representative of the universe itself, we witness the bonding of 2 souls brought together across worlds. David glanced at Raimi. Her amber eyes were already glistening. The mayor continued. 1 from Earth. He looked at David. 1 from Etheris. He turned to Raimi. Joined by truth, by love, and by the will of the universe. At those words, Raimi's mother covered her mouth. Tears began spilling down her cheeks. Beside her, Raimi's grandmother wiped her own eyes and smiled even wider. David noticed them and his own throat tightened. The mayor turned a page. David read Smith. David straightened. Do you choose, Raimi, of your own heart and free will, to walk beside you as your bonded soulmate for all your days? David didn't even need a full second. Yes. His voice was strong. Clear. The mayor nodded. Then looked to Raimi. Raimi, do you choose, David, of your own heart and free will, to walk beside you as your bonded soulmate for all your days? Raimi looked directly into David's eyes. Her tail tightened around his arm. Yes. Her voice trembled slightly from emotion. But with all my heart. The mayor smiled. Then held out his hands. Once you place the rings on each other's fingers. He paused. You will be bonded. David carefully took 1 ring from the cloth pouch. Raimi took the other. Their hands trembled slightly. But both smiled. David slid the old family ring gently onto Raimi's finger. She looked down at it, tears spilling freely now. Then Raimi took the 2nd ring and placed it onto David's finger. The instant the ring settled into place, something happened. Both red cards resting on the mayor's desk flared with warm crimson light. The room went silent. The cards glowed brightly for several heartbeats. Then slowly faded. The mayor smiled deeply. It is done! Before he could say anything more, Raimi stepped forward. David met her halfway. And they kissed. Not shyly. Not awkwardly. But with all the love that had grown over 6 months of shared dreams, memories, and longing. Raimi's mother began openly crying happy tears. Her grandmother joined her. Even Raimi's father discreetly cleared his throat and looked suspiciously emotional. When David and Raimi finally pulled apart, they were both smiling so brightly it seemed impossible not to. The mayor closed the ceremonial book. Well, he folded his hands. I will need a little time to arrange the house and land. David nodded. The mayor continued. I will have my assistant find you sometime this week. Raimi smiled. Thank you. As everyone began relaxing, the assistant suddenly looked at Raimi with surprise. Wait. Raimi blinked. Yes? The assistant tilted her head. Are you the owner of Raimi's Hearth? Raimi nodded. Yes. The assistant's face brightened. Wonderful food, by the way. Raimi's ears perked proudly. Thank you. The assistant smiled. In that case, I'll look very hard for a home near your restaurant. David and Raimi looked at each other. Then, at exactly the same moment, they both said, Thank you for working so hard. The words came out in perfect unison. The entire room burst into laughter. Raimi covered her mouth, laughing. David shook his head in amused disbelief. The mayor smiled warmly. And for a brief moment, as the laughter filled the room, the sunlight shining through the ceremonial chamber seemed just a little brighter. As though somewhere beyond the stars. Vixie was smiling too. When the laughter finally settled and the ceremony ended, David and Raimi thanked the mayor and the witnesses one more time before leaving the office hand in hand. Either of them let go. Not once. As they stepped out into the sunlight of Volnester, Raimi looked down at the ring on her finger. Then up at David. Her ears tilted playfully. A smile slowly spread across her face. I think I owe you a steak dinner, my husband. David stopped walking just long enough to grin at her. The word hit him in the best possible way. He gently kissed the back of her hand. I can't wait to eat it, my beautiful wife. Raimi's ears turned bright pink, and her tail swished happily behind her. She squeezed his hand and practically pulled him toward Raimi's hearth. That evening, after the restaurant closed to customers, Raimi cooked only for him. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of sizzling meat, soft music, and the occasional teasing comment that made them both laugh. David sat nearby while she worked, watching her move with effortless skill. He had seen her cook in dreams. But seeing it in person was something entirely different. She moved with confidence, grace, and focus. And every now and then she would glance at him just to make sure he was still watching. He always was. When she finally set the plate in front of him, David stared for a moment. Perfectly seared meat. Soft whipped potatoes made from an ethereous root vegetable. Seasoned vegetables with herbs he had never smelled before. He took one bite. Then looked at her. Raimi's ears twitched nervously. Well? David swallowed slowly. Then smiled. You somehow made my favorite meal better than I ever imagined. Raimi let out the breath she had been holding and laughed with relief. Her tail swayed proudly. I practiced. David raised an eyebrow. For me? Raimi smiled and leaned over the table. For my husband. David had no defense against that. After dinner, they returned to Raimi's home above the restaurant. For the first time, there were no dreams to wait for. No waking apart. No wondering when they would see each other again. Now they were together every day. And every night. The following week passed in the kind of happiness that made time feel unreal. David learned the rhythms of Raimi's home. Raimi learned how David always smiled when he was concentrating on making something. They spent mornings sharing breakfast. Afternoons at the restaurant. Evenings talking, laughing, and sitting close enough that neither ever wanted to move away. And when the restaurant closed each night, they had the privacy they had both waited 6 long months for. Time alone as a married couple. Learning one another in all the quiet ways that only came when no one else was there. By the end of the week, David no longer felt like a visitor from another world. He felt like he belonged. Exactly where he was. 8 days after the bonding ceremony, while Raimi was finishing the lunch rush at the restaurant, a familiar face appeared at the front door. The mayor's assistant. Raimi's hearth had grown quiet for the afternoon, so she was easy to spot. She smiled the moment she saw them. I believe I have something to show you. Raimi's ears perked. David set down the tray he was carrying. The assistant handed them a folded paper with an address written on it. Meet me there in 1 hour. She smiled knowingly. You may want to bring your excitement. An hour later, David and Raimi followed the directions to the outskirts of the city. The road led farther than either expected. Soon the buildings gave way to open countryside, rolling fields, and forested hills. When they arrived at the address, both stopped walking and simply stared. The mayor's assistant stood waiting beside a gate. Behind her stretched an enormous property. A massive open plot of land, miles across. Wide green fields, scattered trees, and in the center, a large 6-bedroom home built from stone and polished timber. It stood proudly in the middle of the land like something out of a dream. Raimi's mouth fell open. David blinked several times. This is ours? The assistant smiled. She held up the official documents. Blessed by Vixie herself. The mayor approved it immediately. Raimi squeezed David's hand so tightly he nearly laughed. The assistant pointed toward the distant city road. It is approximately a 10-minute drive to Raimi's hearth. David looked around the land, already thinking like a craftsman. He turned slowly, taking in the open space. Then he smiled. I can build a workshop here. Raimi looked at him. He pointed toward a wide flat area not far from the house. There's enough space that the noise won't bother any neighbors. The assistant laughed. That was actually one reason the mayor chose this property. David looked genuinely touched. Raimi leaned against him, staring at the house. Her tail wrapped around his waist again. It's perfect. David turned toward her. Then looked at the house. The land. The sky above Etheris. And finally at the ring on his hand. He smiled in quiet disbelief. A few weeks ago he had been asleep in his apartment on Earth. Now he stood beside his wife on another world, looking at the land where they would build their future. He slipped his arm around Raimi's shoulders. She leaned into him without hesitation. And together they walked through the gate to see their new home. The moment the mayor's assistant handed them the keys, David and Raimi looked at each other with matching excitement. Then both of them broke into a run. Hand in hand, laughing like children, they hurried down the long stone path toward the massive house sitting in the center of the property. Raimi's tail streamed behind her as she ran. David could not stop grinning. When they reached the front door, both were breathing hard from excitement. Raimi held up the key dramatically. Ready? David nodded immediately. Oh, absolutely. She unlocked the door. The moment it swung open, both of them froze. Then, in perfect unison, wow! They stared inside with wide eyes. Beautiful! The entire home was already furnished. Warm polished wood floors stretched through the enormous living room. Soft rugs covered parts of the floor. Large comfortable couches sat around a stone fireplace. Elegant crystal lighting glowed gently overhead. The kitchen was massive, larger even than the one in Raimi's apartment above Raimi's hearth. David stepped slowly inside, looking around in disbelief. This is incredible. Raimi wandered into the kitchen and immediately gasped. David! He hurried over. She pointed excitedly. The kitchen had multiple ovens, huge preparation counters, hanging cookware racks, and enough room for several cooks at once. Her ears stood straight up with excitement. I could test recipes here. David laughed. I had a feeling that would be your favorite room. Raimi turned and hugged him instantly. You know me too well already. They spent the next hour exploring every room. 6 bedrooms. A huge dining room. A library. A sunroom overlooking the fields. Even a deep stone cellar beneath the house. Every few minutes one of them would call out excitedly for the other to come see something. David, look at this bathtub. Raimi, this room would be perfect for guests. David, there's enough pantry space for months of ingredients. Raimi, look how big this fireplace is. By the time they finally returned outside, both of them were smiling so hard their cheeks hurt. The afternoon breeze rolled gently across the enormous property. David stood quietly for a moment, looking over the land. Then he pointed toward a wide open area a short distance from the house. Right there. Raimi looked where he pointed. David smiled. That's where I'll build my workshop. Raimi immediately nodded. Oh, absolutely. She could already imagine it. The sound of metalworking. The glow of the forge at night. David building beautiful things only a short walk from home. Then David rubbed the back of his neck thoughtfully. I actually had another idea too, if you're okay with it. Raimi tilted her head curiously. What kind of idea? David looked toward the house. Then toward the open land again. I want to make a statue of Vixie. Raimi blinked. A statue? David nodded. A life-sized metal one. His expression softened. She changed both our lives forever. Raimi's eyes warmed instantly. David smiled slightly. I was thinking maybe we could place it somewhere near the house. Raimi wrapped her arms around one of his and leaned against him. I think she would love that. David looked relieved. Good. Then his expression brightened again. And after that, I have a few ideas for the restaurant. Raimi's ears perked immediately. Oh? David grinned. I want to expand the dining area. Raimi stared. Really? David nodded enthusiastically. And I want to make artwork for the walls. Now Raimi looked genuinely curious. What kind of artwork? David smiled at her warmly. I want to make a metal hand-inscribed picture of you cooking the first steak dinner you made for me. Raimi's eyes widened. David held his hands apart to show the size. About 3 feet by 5 feet. Raimi covered her mouth. David. And I want it hanging inside Raimi's hearth. Raimi looked so overwhelmed with happiness she could barely speak. Finally she stepped forward and wrapped both arms tightly around his waist. You really love me that much? David immediately wrapped his arms around her in return. With all my heart. Raimi's tail curled happily around him. Then she looked up at the huge house, the endless land, and the open sky of Etheris above them. A few tears slipped down her cheeks again. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that this was real. Their home. Their future. Their life together. And beside her stood the man the universe had chosen just for her. Over the next several weeks, life slowly settled into a peaceful rhythm for David and Raimi. Mornings were usually spent together at home, sharing breakfast while planning the day. Afternoons belonged mostly to Raimi's hearth. And evenings were often spent walking the property together, talking about everything they still wanted to build. David had already started drawing plans for his future workshop. But before beginning construction, there was one important project he wanted to finish first. The pendant for the mayor's daughter. For now, David had converted part of the large storage shed near the house into a temporary metalworking area. It was simple. A sturdy work table. Basic tools. A small forge setup. But it was enough. And for the first time since leaving Earth, David truly felt at home while working with metal again. For several days he worked carefully on the pendant. Every detail mattered. He chose polished silver for the main body and shaped it into a smooth circular locket similar to Raimi's pendant, but with a design unique to the mayor's family. Because the mayor's family was vulpine, David carefully handcrafted a beautiful fox effigy onto the front cover. Elegant. Proud. Detailed enough that each strand of fur seemed almost alive in the light. On the back, he hand-inscribed the words, Happy 11th birthday. From Daddy and Mommy. He spent extra time making sure every letter was perfect. Once the metalwork was complete, he carefully placed the pictures inside. On one side was a picture of the mayor's daughter smiling brightly. On the other side was a family picture of the mayor and his wife together. When the pendant closed, the fox design aligned perfectly across both halves. David leaned back in his chair and smiled proudly. Yeah, he said quietly to himself. That came out nice. Raimi appeared in the doorway of the shed a few moments later. She had flour on one cheek from baking earlier that morning. Her tail swayed curiously. Finished? David held it up. Raimi's eyes widened immediately. Oh, David! She walked closer and carefully opened the pendant. The moment she saw the pictures inside, her ears lifted warmly. That is beautiful. David smiled slightly. I wanted it to feel personal. Raimi looked at him lovingly. You always put your whole heart into things. David laughed softly. Well, I learned from the best chef on Etheris. Raimi immediately blushed. You flirt too much. And yet you keep smiling every time I do. Raimi's tail flicked happily behind her. Once the pendant was placed carefully into a polished wooden gift box, David decided not to wait. He wanted to deliver it personally. So later that afternoon, he traveled back into Volnester and made his way to the mayor's office. The receptionist recognized him instantly. Well, hello again, Mr. Redsmith. David smiled politely. Afternoon. She noticed the box in his hands. Oh. Her expression brightened. Is that the pendant? David nodded. It's finished. Only a few moments later, the mayor himself stepped out of his office. The moment he saw David holding the wooden box, his face lit up. You finished it already? David handed him the box carefully. The mayor opened it slowly, then fell completely silent. He lifted the pendant gently from the box, staring at the craftsmanship. His eyes softened when he opened it and saw the family pictures inside. Then he turned it over and read the inscription. For several long seconds he said nothing. Finally he looked up at David. My boy. His voice sounded genuinely emotional. This is one of the finest gifts I have ever seen. David rubbed the back of his neck modestly. I'm glad you like it. The mayor shook his head. Like it? He laughed softly. My daughter is going to treasure this for the rest of her life. He closed the pendant carefully and looked at David with deep respect. You have an extraordinary talent. David smiled politely. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The mayor placed the pendant back into its box almost reverently. Then he smiled warmly. You know. He leaned back slightly. I think Vixie chose very wisely bringing you here. David blinked in surprise, then smiled quietly. I think so too. 5 years passed peacefully on Etheris. And in those 5 years, David and Raimi built a life more beautiful than either of them could have imagined during those first shared dreams. Near the front of their enormous property stood a towering 10-foot statue crafted entirely by David himself. It was a breathtaking work of art. The statue depicted Vixie seated calmly on her cushion, wearing the same gentle smile she had worn the night she changed their lives forever. Every detail had been painstakingly crafted by hand. The folds of her robes, the softness of her expression, the wisdom in her eyes. David had spent nearly 6 months working on it during the early years of their marriage. And at the base of the statue rested a polished bronze plaque engraved with elegant lettering, representative of the universe, who brought 2 souls together across the stars. Travelers occasionally stopped at the property just to see the statue. Some even left flowers near its base. David always smiled quietly whenever he noticed. Because without Vixie, none of this would exist. David's workshop had grown far beyond the simple shed he originally planned. What now stood on the property looked more like a master craftsman's hall. Massive forge rooms, metalworking stations, carving tables, storage areas filled with precious metals and materials from all across Etheris. The building itself was beautiful, constructed from polished stone, dark timber, and metalwork David had crafted himself. Large windows allowed warm sunlight to spill across the work floors. And despite its size, the workshop still somehow felt welcoming. David had become widely respected throughout Volnester for his craftsmanship. People traveled from distant cities to commission his work. Custom jewelry, decorative metal art, architectural pieces, ceremonial blades, even sculptures. But his favorite projects were still the personal ones, the ones made for family. Meanwhile, Raimi's hearth had transformed into something legendary. David's expansion of the dining area had doubled the restaurant's size while somehow keeping its warm and cozy atmosphere intact. The walls displayed beautiful handcrafted metal artwork created by David. The centerpiece remained the enormous 3-foot by 5-foot metal wall engraving of Raimi cooking the first steak dinner she had ever made for him. Customers loved it. And Raimi secretly loved watching David proudly pretend not to notice when people complimented it. The restaurant had become world famous. Travelers came from across Etheris just for the chance to eat there. Food critics spoke of Raimi with admiration usually reserved for royalty or legendary artists. By the 5th year, she was officially considered one of the top 3 chefs in the entire world. And despite the fame, she still smiled the most whenever David praised her cooking. But the greatest change over those 5 years wasn't the house, or the workshop, or the restaurant. It was their children. The home that once felt enormous now constantly echoed with laughter, running footsteps, and playful chaos. David and Raimi had 4 children together, each one carrying traits from both worlds. Their oldest son, Cale, was already adventurous and fearless like his father. He loved following David around the workshop and constantly asked questions about metalworking. Their second child, Lyra, had inherited Raimi's creativity and curiosity. She spent most of her time either helping in the kitchen or reading books far above her age level. The twins, Soren and Lumi, kept the entire household busy almost every hour of the day. Soren loved climbing absolutely everything. Lumi adored sitting in David's lap while he worked and insisted every metal creation needed more sparkle. The house that once seemed almost too large now felt perfectly full. One evening, after the restaurant closed for the night, David and Raimi stood together outside their home beneath the 3 moons of Etheris. The distant lights from David's workshop glowed warmly across the property. The soft sound of children laughing drifted faintly through an upstairs window. Raimi rested against David's chest while his arms wrapped comfortably around her waist. Her tail curled happily around him. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes I still can't believe all this happened." David smiled against her hair. "You mean the part where a magical fox woman connected us through dreams across the galaxy?" Raimi laughed quietly. "Yes. That part." David looked out across the property. The statue. The workshop. Their home. Their life. Then he looked down at the woman in his arms. "I'd cross the stars all over again for you." Raimi's amber eyes glowed softly in the moonlight. "And I'd wait for you all over again." Inside the house, one of the twins suddenly shouted something loudly followed by crashing noises. David sighed dramatically. "There goes my workshop hammer." Raimi burst into laughter. Then both of them hurried back inside together. To the beautiful, chaotic, wonderful life they had built. Because the universe had decided long ago that their souls belong together. Thank you for listening. If you liked the story, please consider leaving a like and subscribe.